this is the second meeting of several. Will be on this topic of navigating the reopening process, starting with accounting for our current expenditures, projecting some upcoming ones, linking those back into probable sources for us to seek reimbursements, and to build a guidance list, both on expense reimbursements and a guidance list for reopening, created with the practitioners themselves, educators, districts from around the country. So thank you again for joining us. We have a chat box that we use frequently in these meetings. So as thoughts come to mind, questions come to mind as we go through the presentation, which we keep the presentation part fairly brief, go ahead and type your question, type your comment in the box to everyone, and then we will address the question, open it up for conversation as we go. So thank you again for everybody for joining. Let's just get right to it, and we will end on time as said. So our objectives for these meetings is to share updates on federal funding for local and state educational agencies related to COVID-19, to create and share tools that can help track and share incurred expenses and expected expenses related to COVID-19, because this is hitting all of our budgets as revenues are going down. And so we want to look at where reimbursements are possible, to provide a handy checklist for folks to go to and use to expedite those repayments. And then to develop some templates for helping to look at reopening in different segments, from getting adults into the building to then getting kids back in the building in different scenarios in age appropriate and healthy ways, insofar as possible. So just introductions again, this conversation is one that we want to open nationwide, and it's something with the National Council of School Facilities 21st Century Fund, represented with Mary Filardo, who's co-presenting here today. So Mary, please say hi, and then just as you get going. And we will, this is Cooperative Strategies. We're a K-12 planning firm. Had the opportunity to work with Mary for years, and this is an opportunity. We said, let's bring folks together. No one of us has all the answers as to what expenditures are out there and how to seek reimbursements. No one of us has all the answers, of course, as to what to do about reopening. But we thought the best way to proceed is to open up conversation and have very focused conversation, to have a recorded conversation, to build documents based upon the conversation, and to do so in a pretty time certain way. We're looking at 4 to 6 weeks for our first sprint of exercises here to produce actionable documents. We want these conversations to bear fruit into documents that you all can use in the field. Okay. So our agenda today, we are going to have 15 minutes till 3:15, which is about 11 minutes left. I want to do a brief skim over of updates on federal funding. For those of you who joined the first meeting, we sent out the recording. If you were not at that first meeting and you want to get the initial dump and information on the CARES Act and what that means to you in terms of the different funding opportunities, please reach out to me or Mary and we'll get you that recording if you don't have it already. We will, after introductions, we're going to go over federal policy and funding updates each week, Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. We will review a school reopening planning framework that we've drafted that will be refined by you all and with you all throughout this process. Review a budgeting worksheet tool that we started that we'll work on today in small groups. And we will, in about 3:15 Eastern Standard, shortly thereafter, we're going to break into small groups, all of you, groups of anywhere from 4 to no more than 8, where we can work on the topics of building a list of expenses that you know you've incurred for COVID related, that are COVID related to date, and then to look at some expected COVID related expenses and to look at some initial tactics to get adults safely and operationally back in your facilities, probable summertime horizon. And next week, we will build upon those documents and move into the tougher question, which is doing the same with students. There's a lot of documents out there. We've compiled some of them and put it into a checklist for you. So Mary, if you could unmute, and then, well, I'll unmute you here. And if you could just walk us through briefly what's happening currently regarding federal policy funding.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me, David?
Yeah, I can hear you. You're fine. You're good.
Yeah. And also just on the introduction side, I just want to welcome particularly all of the state facilities officials who are represented here. We've got, from I think New Hampshire to California to Oregon, Rhode Island, Georgia. We've got a good group here. Thank you folks for joining us, because I know you've got a lot to offer. So on the federal policy side, of course, we're looking at, what was emergency legislation on March 4th, which was about $8.3 billion. And then the big CARES Act, March 27th, which is $2 trillion. And that's what the funding that has about $13.5 billion for, eligible for K-12 schools. And then really dedicated to K-12. There was just another bill that I don't think is yet signed by the president, but has been passed for $484 billion. And there was some discussion about, more help for states and municipalities and school districts in this, but it's primarily a bill for business relief and, personal paycheck protection. There is discussion now. I know I just got an email from Chairman Scott's committee asking about information on school facilities, because they are definitely looking at a stimulus that would have infrastructure in it. You can see I posted here the tweet of Donald Trump on the 21st, again, talking about legislative fiscal relief with infrastructure investments for bridges, tunnels, and broadband. And what you can see is that schools are not mentioned there. And this is part of our job. Go to the next slide, David. Let's see, I'm not seeing the next slide. Oh, there we go. So part of the challenge for the facilities is, of course, that there are not currently federal programs that are dedicated to funding the learning environment, indoor or outdoor, really. There are some very limited provisions for using federal funds for facility-related expenditures, but they're just minuscule compared to what local and state are spending. FEMA is actually the biggest funder of public school facilities, so that kind of gives you an idea of that environment. So not only aren't there federal programs, we also are sort of an afterthought in the federal infrastructure planning, but we need to change this. Go ahead. And this is my pitch, because part of what we have to do is we have to make sure that our decision makers in Washington understand that public school facilities, we really can't afford to see the kind of drop off that we saw after 2008, when at that point school districts were spending an average about $50 billion a year on school construction, and it dropped down below $30 billion a year with the recession. And we just, schools are 10 years older. We just can't afford to do this again. We need to have a dedicated funding stream for our K-12 facilities in this. And so we're asking folks, if they can, I know the National Council has signed on, but other industry, civic, labor groups to sign on to this. We've already got over 100 signatures, but the more the better. So we ask you to really let our voices be heard on this. And go to I think there's one more slide. No, go back one then, because the one thing, it might be at the end, but I think that in terms of the issues here that, and we can talk about it with regard to the budget tool, but there are waivers that facilities directors should be looking at to make sure that federal dollars that are going through the state can be used for school facility issues. And
yeah, we have that in the appendix. We'll send that out to everybody.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, David. That's all.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to have a short and sweet update as federal funding evolves daily, weekly on these calls. And so I see a couple of questions coming in there about, will this deck be sent out? Yes, we'll send out the deck. We'll send out the chat notes from you all. We'll send out the recording as we go. Okay, so we're actually running a tick ahead, which is not a bad thing. We wanted to not do death by PowerPoint, but just keep it short and sweet on the data that we have in hand that's new from the last week, and then get to the meat of the work here today, which is going to be the small group breakouts. Okay, so what we got? So at the risk of stating the obvious, we have a wicked problem. And we have a public health emergency, public education generational challenge, and an economic generational challenge as well. So we started, of course, with some assumptions going in here. And so critique away as you receive this document. You want to add, edit to some of these assumptions. We want this to be a robust argument moving forward on not only the problem, but some potential solutions for guidance for folks. Okay, so one, staff and students do need to be safe during the pandemic, for which there is now, and not for at least this year, any vaccine. So the tools to reduce the risk of the high levels of person and facility hygiene and social distancing are what we have in our toolbox. Second, public education environments are not organized or funded to support what we need to do right now. And so we have to be creative. We have to do different. It's going to be expensive. At the same time, the economy, of course, is challenged, and parents cannot be fully productive without districts providing schooling and after-school care to children in their community. And schools will not receive adequate funding without economies thriving. It is a symbiotic relationship, of course. So here's some of our assumptions going into this exercise to create some guidance here. One, there will not be a vaccine for the next school year. Two, there'll be improvements in understanding the virus and in testing that will allow public health officials to act with greater precision when taking steps to slow the rate of infection. So we cross our fingers that things will get better, but it's not going to be a turnkey. Second wave of infections is probable in the flu season. Impact is unknown, but closures may come again. Children and staff with significant health conditions will be especially vulnerable, but still need to be served and protected. Public school districts will need to use cleaning, personal health protocols, and distancing at levels consistent with public health risks and state, local mandates, and federal. Mental health considerations for students and their families and staff will need to be factored in to all of the above. Schools, public education assumptions. Schools are essential to public welfare, providing safe childcare, social, emotional support, and nutrition for enabling the parents to be productive in the workforce. Even when planned and supported, a quality K-12 education includes extensive social experiences, which e-learning alone and prolonged social distancing strongly challenge. Educational funding will be stretched to make up for the learning loss for all students, particularly for children and youth already experiencing educational opportunity gaps in their schooling, i.e. the opportunity gap and the achievement gap is certainly widening as we speak. Decision-making assumptions. School districts will, of course, comply with federal, state, and local policies. Districts should be including their stakeholders in the planning and decision-making process required to open schools. That's in a way that's locally consistent and well communicated. While public governmental bodies will provide some policy and guidance, most districts will have to exercise some latitude and local control to decide specific strategies and tactics to safely and effectively educate their students. And federal, state, local funding to meet the public health, education, and childcare demands of communities will be uncertain. So what we've started here, and we sent out to those who are on the email list already, and those who are not on the email list, you will receive it immediately following this meeting, a PowerPoint, and what you'll have now is a checklist that we've created as a draft for you to work on in these small groups. So one, we want to look at some public health strategies for reopening schools, for increasing levels of cleanliness and disinfecting, improving air quality, personal health and hygiene protocols for staff and students, social distancing for staff and students, and then specific strategies we've organized into the basic questions: what needs to be done, who needs to do it, where does the task need to be done, when does it need to be done, and how often. So we've created this into a grid, which we'll work on here, and you will receive an email to complete and focus on for the next meeting, where we have proposed a list of strategies. 1, plan for increased levels of cleaning and infecting. 2, disinfecting schools. 2, plan for improving air quality. 3, plan for personal hygiene and protocols. You saw this list in the PowerPoint. Underneath each of these list of proposed strategies are individual tactics that we've, Mary and I, through searching what other districts are proposing, states, local entities are proposing, created a list to start the conversation. Then we have a list of what needs to be done, who needs to do it, and created a sample drop-down list to answer each of these questions so we can be consistent. When you receive this document, each of these drop-down lists link to another sheet that we have space for you to add different ideas or suggest edits to the ones, because we know this is just a starter list of these different answers to these questions or potential answers to these questions, not the final. So we want this to be crowdsourced and best of all worlds, best of everybody's minds here. In addition to the strategies for reopening, focused on the different elements here, we have an expense tracking sheet that we are building that we're going to focus our time on today, or starting with in our small groups. So what we're going to ask you to do, on our last call, several folks mentioned putting Wi-Fi on buses, extra costs for feeding students, extra costs for cleaning schools and so forth, and extra cost on top of existing capital programs due to the need for increased safety protocols, which is causing prices and time to increase. So what we're asking you to do in our small groups here in just a second is that you work on describing the expenses that you are incurring right now, and just write those out. Somebody write those out in a Word doc, in a notepad, whatever makes sense to you. In each small group, we're going to ask to have a scribe to take those notes. What are the expenses you are currently incurring related to COVID? And once that list is done in your group, just quickly put that together and see, are there additional expenses that you expect to incur? That could take 15 to 20 minutes. Try to be efficient with time there. And then in the remaining 5 to 10, however much time you have left of your half hour, to think about what are some of the strategies that you can use to safely allow staff back in the building. And we're going to start that conversation today. We're going to pick that up next week, and then move that conversation from staff to students using the initial list that we've drafted here, which was sent out an email yesterday. So that's our task. We're actually a couple minutes behind now. So I'm going to go ahead and break everybody into small groups. And what I'm going to ask everybody to do is a volunteer from each group to be the scribe, to take some notes on a Word doc about the conversation, and then email those notes to Mary and I. Our emails are at the bottom of this presentation, and many of you have it from the invitation. I'm going to call us back, since we're a couple minutes late, I'm going to call us back between 3:45 p.m. Eastern and 3:50 p.m. Eastern Standard. And we will come back to the large group, do a quick whip around report out, and then I will collect your notes via email. Mary and I will concatenate them and send out notes prior to our next meeting on Thursday. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and now break us into small groups. So we are going to have 8 groups of 5 to 6. It's going to divide you randomly. And please introduce yourself briefly, select a note taker or volunteer yourself, and then you will see a notice of when you will be punted back into the large group meeting, and I will float between meetings as time allows. Okay, so in just a minute, you will break into your small groups. Again, please volunteer or voluntold somebody to be the note taker, and we will convene shortly. Well, appreciate everybody bearing through the technology here as we break into small groups, come back. Sometimes it can be a little disruptive, but I was able to join some of the conversations, and not all, but some good topics. So what I'd like to ask now is, we have about 10 minutes left on this meeting. And just, if I could just ask members of a couple groups, I'll just pick randomly, let's say group Two, if somebody from group 2 can give us a 60-second download on what were your key topics that you discussed in your small group breakout. Group 2. That was Jeff, Lynette, Rob, Burtz, Robert Searcy, Amy Clark.
David, this is Jeff Vincent in California. I took notes. I'd be happy to, I guess, do that unless someone else really wants to do it.
You have the floor.
Okay. Very quickly, what we talked about, increased food costs, but we actually had some districts that weren't doing food prep or delivery, so they weren't incurring those costs. So that's clearly some districts dealing with it. I think, one of the things that struck me was that a comment from Delaware in particular, which resonated with some of what I've heard in California, is that it's kind of hard to tell what the immediate expenses are going to be because pricing is changing on things like materials and supplies, et cetera, is changing daily, and equipment, even the availability is fluctuating. And Baltimore was actually giving us some exact pricing that they were getting on N95 masks, for example, working with different vendors. So folks are really trying to understand what this stuff is costing, and it's changing almost daily. We talked a little bit about things on the return, about, if we have different schedules, et cetera, this is going to be different energy costs in buildings, and thinking about changing filters and HVAC adjustments. We talked a little bit about added transportation costs in the fall. And then more immediately, we talked about some added costs for digital tools like Chromebook and Zoom, et cetera. And I think that more or less sums it up, but folks were coding these expenses as COVID specific.
Okay, good, thank you. And yeah, appreciate that list. We'll put them all together and then share everybody everybody will have a master list. If you could share me your notes. Let's just go even numbers. Group 4, Brad, Doug, Hysun, Jerome, Lindsay, and Lori. Somebody volunteer to give a debrief.
Hey David, this is Lindsay. I work for the State of Oregon Department of Education, so happy to be on the call. Nice to see you all. A couple things that we talked about in our group was the inventory of the cleaning supplies. Are we stocking up right now or waiting for those new year POs to start encumbering? And then some of our fellows were contacting vendors to see if products would be available, but they're back ordered for several months. And so, and even when we're able to purchase masks or gloves, the supply orders have been lagging because of the high demand right now. I think one of the other concerns we talked about is when everyone returns, how are we going to keep that daily deep clean process going? It's going to be difficult to achieve. We mentioned that each custodian right now, roughly their normal cleaning responsibilities is about 16,000 square feet right now. And so having to do a deep clean on that, we're just thinking maybe some other areas might have to fall off or drop. The other thing we mentioned, and we're talking about, we had a question on how students are coming back to empty their lockers and collect their belongings. And so we had a few share that they have the school staff emptying the lockers and bagging them up and then making arrangements or time for parents and students to do kind of a drive-through through the parking lot to pick up those personal belongings and go that route. So that's kind of what we shared about, a few other things, but I'll email you our notes from group 4. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, we'll go evens then odds as time permits. Group 6, we had Angela, Jerry, Kara, Lenny, and Lynette.
Hi, yes. So we had a good group of folks from Baltimore, Oregon, Delaware, Philly, and Pittsburgh. And a lot of what we discussed echoed some of the other concerns. Something that was brought up is the uncertainty of what to be ordered and when. So again, echoing some of those timelines. Also some staffing needs and anticipating increase in costs related to that. There are school districts who don't have substitutes for custodial staff, and there is a concern that more custodial staff may be needed, especially when thinking about school facilities that also double as public use spaces. So sports stadiums, theater, pools, things like that, and after school programs as well. There was also concern about transportation, meaning cleaning school buses and how social distancing would look like for students who need to be transported to go to school, and working with different transportation companies to have a standardized protocol for that. Coding items as reimbursable as COVID expenses. And also, we were talking a little bit about if there is a suspected case in a school when school is reopened, how do you follow CDC guidelines to isolate a student or staff without violating HIPAA, but also, you know, having best practices for cleaning and being really responsive to that and the movement of a lot of people and not a lot of space in school buildings. And,
yeah, and that's going to be focus. That's great. Thank you. That's going to be a focus of next week's as well. Is the movement of students, and a lot of the strategies out there right now focusing on moving teachers instead of students when possible. You know, and so some of the strategies that we need to put out there for some guidance would be, you know, if somebody would contract COVID in that group, are you going to be able to set up your strategies such that the fewest number of kids and adults possible would have to quarantine, where the remainder of the students and population can continue? How do we develop tactics and strategies that can make that work? Group 8, thank you, Connie, Edward, Frederick, and Paul.
Right, I'm the one with notes, so I'll go ahead and share. Paul Mills with Canyon Design, happy to be part of this. A lot of echoed common themes from before. The notion of hazard pay and the differentiation between actual hazard pay, supplemental costs versus just straight overtime, whether different flavors are reimbursable or not is in question. Talked about the cost of internet hotspots, at least in California, specifically Monrovia near LA. They've been challenged by the California Office of Emergency Services, saying that those would be ineligible for any sort of reimbursement. We talked a lot about food service, which was touched on earlier. Some anecdotes and stuff we'll share in the notes, but probably be redundant to some of the earlier statements. Talked about transportation, incremental costs for delivering food as opposed to the food or the people being served coming to the food, being an incremental cost that approaching for reimbursement. We talked also about revenue side. You know, there is direct expenses that are incurred, but there's also this, you know, if you have programs that miles driven or meals served or just tax revenues that are probably going to be diminished, while not a direct hit to cost, it is a hit to the bottom line, and whether those might be under discussion, and we discussed that. Mental health and counseling, we touched on that a little bit. And just kind of not really specific to reimbursement, but challenges associated with some custodial crews having reluctance to enter facilities unless there's some assurances that it's, you know, the place has been empty and for 2 weeks time or something like that. Some challenges being faced. Yeah. Frederick, anyone else you want to pile on? Anything else?
And so, some of it was, I think, just the difficulties in getting supplies and which supplies you can use also. And then the whole wild card of FEMA. How do you do that? How do you navigate that?
FEMA is a 4-letter word.
Yes.
Connie, do you have anything else we might have missed?
No, thank you. You did a good job. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we still got a couple minutes here, so let's go back and give our group, odd-numbered groups a chance to share any unique cost elements or sort of tactical discussions on getting adults back in the building that you would like to share. Let's start group 1, Michelle, Mike, Rob. No volunteers? Okay, very good. How about group 3, Andy, Barbara, Michael, Elliott, Peter Grunwald, Sherry Ellie, able to join your group briefly? Can you sort of highlights of your discussion there? Okay, I think like we might have some folks that were on their way out already. So let's go ahead. We can go ahead and close out the meeting. So what we'll do, if again, let me just share my screen. And if you could, those of you who took notes, if you have lists, I know I was able to join a group where we have, I think it was from Iowa, already started to create a list. I know Lynette from Baltimore was coding their expenses. If you could send those, if you don't mind, to Mary Filardo at 21cff.org, or myself, dsturts at coopstrategies.org, or both. Send those in your notes from today. We will create them as, again, into a master list, populate this expense tracking sheet for you all, and send it back out to everybody who was on the first call and everybody who's on this call. We'll get that out to you no later than next Tuesday. So comments, questions that you want pursued by that meeting or have hanging over from this meeting, please feel free to reach out to us. Appreciate your participation in this meeting. Again, we are hoping to, by early May 7th to be exact, to have an initial list created of unique expense types with some different reimbursement pools to go to and guidance there to distribute to all of you all, and hopefully provide a well-informed list to help guide both reimbursements, and then moving on from that, strategies for opening. We plan to meet in this format into June to create some guidance in that respect. So thank you all very much for coming. Have a great, safe rest of your day, and hope to talk to you next Thursday. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.